That's it, really. When you want to turn it off, to the top of your screen on the right, you'll see like a stop button, and
Let's
that.
see.
So you can you see it to the right there?
An
Stop.
application. That's not what I want.
And that's pretty much it, other than the settings. And
Okay.
they seem like they're working fine to me.
So somehow I'm just sharing an application. That's not the point. I want to share the screen.
Okay, so if you close that for me.
Yeah, let's close that again.
And then there should be one that says, when the UI pops up, should be share your screen. Is that?
So that's the thing. It doesn't. It just says, do you allow to observe your screen? And then I say allow, and that's it. And then it pops up like this.
Do you get any options that say, like your entire screen, application window, Chrome tab, or anything like that when you went to the share screen function? We can see your whole screen at the moment. I don't know whether that's what.
Okay, well then that's fine, right?
Yeah.
That's fine.
Cool. Okay, so shall we leave it for just a moment or two to see who comes in there? We'll go from there.
I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't the bottleneck of being on time, that's all.
That's okay. So a busy week this week then?
Yeah, we've got a lot going on at the same time at the moment. So it's a lot of admin stuff. We've got a foundation that's behind our back because we've received a big grant, so we have tons of contracts to do, and at the same time we've got a next release of the game coming out, and I'm writing a TV pilot, so it's just it's a little much at the moment.
Power woman or what?
I know, right? It's just I don't know why I said yes, but to all of it, but it is what it is.
Happens
until end of February. It is what it is.
Yeah, I tried to contact a few of my network to see whether they would be available for this week, and they were just like, it's at end of our contracts. We need to get things out. I haven't got enough time. So thank you so much for giving up your time.
Yeah, it's fine. I love doing things like these. I mean, I was in school once, and the more sort of practical things that you can listen into and hear, I think the better, right?
Definitely. I know that we used to have to pay for anything that was like this, so it's quite nice. Okay, so shall I introduce you to everybody?
Sure.
And say hello for the morning, and then we can get going, Rosemary, if that's all right?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and thanks again for tuning in to Changing Futures Week at the University of Northampton. We've had some good guests this week, and today is no exception. Our first guest today has worked for a variety of tech and games companies in an array of roles, from project manager to international account manager. She is now the founder of Storybyte Studio and the managing consultant for Digging Deep. Please welcome Rosemary Lockhart.
Thank you, Rob. That's a good introduction. I'll add a few things to it just to make sure that people know why I'm even here, right? So this is basically me in a nutshell. I'm a dog lover, as you can see. I just love storytelling, and I generally take on too many things at the same time, which is me in the middle after our first release of the game, basically. I've worked in traditional tech companies and really focused a lot there on storytelling of, how to get boring projects across to customers and really make them interesting. And at some point, when I was like a global account manager at Microsoft, responsible for one of their top 50 customers, I got the opportunity to join a startup, and that startup was, as they called it, playing SimCity in real life. And so we took urban plans, real urban plans of real cities like Riyadh, Shenzhen, even London. We did parts of London like Oxford Circle we were involved on, and also London City Airport and Gatwick, those changes. And then we gamified it. So we basically built it virtually, figured out what went wrong with the planning, played it through, had people move in or move through or whatever it was, and gamified that whole process to then show what the errors were. And that kind of showed me the opportunity that there is in gaming and using games to actually bring a point across and also do it in a more palatable way. And so I decided to after the company was a little bit bigger and it got a little bit more administrative, I decided to switch gears, and I set up my own company, Storybyte Studio. I went to the New York Film Academy to go more in depth in storytelling and the different types of it, like screenwriting, TV writing, and those kinds of things. And then I got started on the Digging Deep project, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, so I'll leave that out here in the introduction for now. So, you know, every story begins with a backstory, right? And so I wanted to just give a little bit of the backstory of why storytelling is important, and how sort of how you can get into that, and how it's evolved, if you will. And then I'm going to go into storytelling itself and sort of the process. And Rob's also asked me to use one of the games that I've worked on to then elaborate a little bit on what that's like. So I've picked a serious game for that, a game with a purpose, just to make sure that it's something that's maybe a little bit different. Feel free to add in, ask any questions. Rob will poke me because all I see is the presentation screen at the moment. But feel free to ask any questions in between as well. And also, obviously, at the end, I'm available as well. So technology has been influenced by movies and by storytelling a lot. There's a lot that was thought up over the years, as you can see here, in movies that then, you know, either people were already working at, and people that were in movies sort of knew that something in that area was going and they did their research. But a lot of times it was also the other way around, where science fiction came up with ideas and then tech people said, what if we could do this? What if this was possible? And so I've just made a little bit of a scale here. I'll hand over the presentation as well. I thought it's a little bit fun to see, you know, how some of these things came to term, like Skype, for example, coming out of a movie and an idea of how to communicate, or even Apple with facial recognition capability, also things that came out of movies, ideas that were taken from there. And I think that's just something to keep in mind, that, you know, story can influence life, life can influence stories. They say talk about what you know, and so obviously you take your whole experience and who you are into whatever story you tell. And I think that's part of the beauty. It's just rich and elaborate. So I always joke that they used to make games about movies, and now they make movies about games. And even these two examples are quite old, of course. But if I look in some of the production planning, you know, in IMD Pro, then you can see that there's a Call of Duty. I mean, you've seen a few of these movies probably already that they're coming out and have come out, like Sonic and the Hedgehog and Minecraft, etc. even. But also, you know, Resident Evil, Call of Duty. I mean, there's so many movies now that are being made about games, where games are the instigators to good storytelling. And I think that's something that's really great and has good potential as well. And you just never know where your game might go and what it might do. So it's well worth really putting the effort into the story and figuring out how to do that. And why do we tell stories? I mean, we tell stories to also get points across, and we see that, you know, more and more games are trying to do that. I've taken a few examples that are more sort of in the area now of going towards serious games. A Concrete Genie, for example, is a game about bullying, and how to overcome that. Some of these games do a more or less good job of getting certain points across, of course. Sea of Solitude is about depression, for example, and I Hope is a game that was born out of a cancer game, a cancer chatbot at the beginning, where you have to conquer your cancer, and it should feel empowering that you play that game and that you actually get to conquer your cancer, virtually make you feel like you are doing this. And so while some of these games are mainstream games, but they want to get a point across, more and more also there's games that are really just specifically created for a purpose, like I Hope, for example, from Hope Labs and Microsoft. And then, you know, why not gaming? I mean, gaming is a serious business. There's so many gamers globally already. People spend more time gaming by the time that they graduate from high school than they've ever been to school. So it is, you know, it's a medium where people are at anyway. So why not use that to then figure out how can we do good things with that? You know, how can we put in positive messages? How can we help with topics like environment or gender inclusivity or anything from health to, you know, more serious, more industrial topics, if you will. Gaming can do so much more, and it's been proven. Video games do change something in your brain, so the learning is active. There's tons of research on that. And I mean, to be fair, also, if you see at the right side, this is a cover from a book in screenwriting. It's called Save the Cat. And it is a lot more fun to actually save the cat than to read, you know, a 35-page fire response time manual, right? So it makes absolute sense, and I think we can do much more with games and with storytelling than we have done before. I was told at the beginning when I started writing and writing for stories and for games is to always keep people wanting more, right? In movies, it's quite linear, the process. You have a storyline, you're, as the writer and the people that make the movie, you bring the audience through the story and through the process. It's one-sided. You have no choice. In gaming, obviously, you have choice. But what you want to do, of course, is you want to make them see more, want to see more. You want to keep them going. And in gaming, to go one step further, you want to try and make them do it themselves, right? That's the push versus the pull. You don't want to just kill them with information. You want to give them enough information so that they can do the tasks that they need to do to then understand the story, the game, the quests, the other players, etc. So how do you do that? Well, there's a couple of elements in story. The obvious one, of course, is dialogue. You can get things across in dialogue. And while dialogue has a good place in gaming, it's often bit on the nose, and that's something I think that gaming companies can learn a lot from storytelling in movies and in TV, by the way, as well. Then there's obviously environmental features. So there's a difference for me for the world and environmental features. That's why I took them separate here. For me, the world is really the gaming world itself, the names, the history, you know, meaning, what time are we in? Is that timeline similar to the timeline of ours? Or do 20 years go within 1 year? You know, where are we? What's the town? What is the meaning of the town? Is it a town? Is it a world? And where did that world come from? How did it come to exist? Then there's circumstances. If there's a battle, why is that battle there? Is it a battle about, you know, the future, about the past? Is it a battle of egos? What's the reason why we are in this world? And then, of course, there's the actual environment. Is it mountains? Is it city? Is it a lake? I mean, whatever it is, right? And there's mobs. There's people, places, things that are in there, baddies, if you will, that you don't necessarily play as a character and that you don't interact with, but they are still there because they give that world more meaning and more context. So a lot of the world building is context. For me, the environmental features goes a step further. It really looks at, okay, what's the environment that this game will be played in? Is it, for example, in the case of I Hope, is this something that we want to push to hospitals, want to push to psychologists? Is it mainstream and we just want to raise awareness? You know, what's the environment outside of the game that will impact your story, that will impact how you tell your story, that will impact who plays your game, and that will impact how your game is designed? Another important thing, I think, is meaningful decisions. Players have an experience, and they hopefully get to make decisions themselves. So the more meaningful you can make those decisions of going left versus right, of picking something up versus not, of shooting somebody versus not, or, you know, working with a team or without a team, the more meaningful you can make those, the more the player feels that experience. And that is not just game mechanics, it is not just game design, it really also comes to story and being able to identify with the steps you take and with the things you do in the game. And the classic, of course, as with dialogue, is also game mechanics. What are the things that you can do within the mechanics to force a certain direction of the story? And I'll talk a little bit more about this when I talk about the serious game that we've created, because that was one of the challenges we had in there. So I'll talk a little bit about the game mechanics there. There's a lot that happens before you actually get to tell your story. For one, of course, you have to have an idea. The idea can come from many places. It can come from you as a writer. It can come from the design team. It can come from a player. It can come from, for example, in the case of my last game, it came from a nonprofit organization, a lady who was wanting to change her book into something that was more fun and applicable for teens. And so it can come from a lot of places. So before you start telling that story, before you start designing it, there's a couple of things that you have to do. What's the idea? Really create that narrative summary of how does your idea come about. In movies, we call this a log line and concept. Can you sum up your game in one line, for example? Can you sum up the game in a couple of paragraphs? What do you want it to do? Why is it there? All those things that I mentioned before, all the things you want your story and your game to do come up in here as well. And also design elements come up in the narrative summary. Not necessarily that you already have to draw them or that the team already has to draw them, but at least have an idea, is it a fictional world? Is it a real world? What are the possibilities? This is not to say that this narrative summary will be the end all. This is a starting point because you have to start somewhere to try and get a discussion going with the team to figure out, okay, what will this be? And so the narrative summary is something that you come back to a lot, even during the process of storytelling. Then you have your backstory. How did this world come to be? How does the game come to be? What's the backstory of the players, for example, the player journeys, if you will? What do they go through? Why is it important? Especially if you do a serious game, that part of player journals is really, really important, and I'll highlight a little bit more about that also when I go into the case study. Then there's locations and levels. What's the place your game plays at? Is it like, do you have 20 levels in it? Is there a certain number of levels? Do you level up? Is it, more linear? Is it not? Is it jumping around? Is it just places and there is no level? All those kinds of things are just good to think about in general. And again, those may change when you have your meetings with the design team, but from a story perspective, it's good to know some of this because gaming versus movies and film is more linear, as I said. And so with, you have to know before you start writing your story what parts are linear and what parts aren't. And when you do that, once you've done that, then you go into a story outline. So what you try to do is you try to get your story across, matching that narrative concept and the backstory and the locations and the levels, and seeing, can I fit certain story elements in there, and how do I do that? And from that, you make a presentation plan. So it's done in different ways. I mean, I've had a couple of different ones. Usually, it's some kind of an online board that we use, something like Mural, for example, or there's a couple of tools. And it's if you've seen Rob before we started, he's got a lot of like sticky notes up on the wall. Sometimes it's as simple as that, right? Where you really look at, okay, what are the actions, the interactions, what are the dependencies, and where are there holes that we have to figure out? And you think of your characters, because the characters, of course, are really, really important. Who plays it? People choose the characters oftentimes. Oftentimes you can't choose characters in games, and so there you also have to make those types of decisions. And according to those, you have to then develop your characters further. The more meaning you can put in those characters, the more people will connect to them. And that's very important when they are playing a character, or when they are trying to root for a character and help a character in a game do something. Even baddies can be liked. There's vampires that we like on shows. There is, bad people like, I don't know, Iron Man to begin with wasn't really very likable, but we like them anyways, or Sherlock Holmes, for example, because we think they're redeemable, or because we think that they're intelligent. There's always something that makes us empathize with them. And so characters are one of the most important parts of storytelling that you can work on. So how does that get into the game? So there's a couple of things that I would say in general. So this is a little bit of the process of how you then get your story into the game. So for one, you have to keep track of everything you do, because storytelling is always, not just in gaming, but also in any other storytelling, revision, revision, revision. We call the first draft a vomit draft for a reason in a lot of these story and script telling parts. So keep track. Make sure that you have something where you can keep track. Then also try to align your drafts with the production milestones, because on a movie, you write a script, then you present the whole script, and that either gets bought or not, but let's say it gets bought, then it gets made, and then that rewriting process starts. So even when you're writing a movie, when you're making a movie, at that point still there's going to be tons of revisions to the script. So you're never just, the script's never what you make it. The movie's never what you made the script. Sorry about that. But what we want to do is we want to really make sure in gaming start earlier. So the more you can share your drafts and your thinking with design, with mechanics and everything, the more you can feed off each other, and it really becomes a joint product. And your story can feed the design, and the design can feed your story, because you may find elements in what the design team did that are really coming back in your story, and that can become really important. So once you've done that, and once you've looked at, okay, here's what I need to produce, then you do try to get a final, as I say, ish script when going into production. But obviously, you're also involved in later areas. So you're involved in production because, as I said, there's tons of revisions probably. Design team will change things. Levels may change. There's user testing. That will have an impact where things change. And so in all those steps of the way, that's something where you should be prepared to really make changes. Then another thing is casting. Depending on if your game actually is recorded and you have people that do like voiceover or acting, you might also be involved in that. And then, of course, also there's proofreading, and that should not be you. It should always be somebody else. But it may come with larger revisions than just spell checks. And then also there is non-dialogue revisions. So one of the important things to do is really to kill. So try to make it shorter and shorter and shorter. And that oftentimes comes once the game is near to finishing, where you can see, okay, well, now we have a beer bottle that has this kind of inscription in the game, and it keeps coming back. So I don't really need the character to say this anymore. Or in our case, in the serious game, we started working with challenges that then explain certain things, and so the guardians, our characters, didn't have to say anymore where the page was, how to find it, where to move to. And so some of these design elements also will give you revisions of the game. So this is just a little bit of an iteration of how the project should work, right? A lot of times we involve the audience at the beginning. Specifically in serious gaming, if you do versus entertainment gaming, we really always start with the audience, because that's who we're designing for. If you're designing a game for a cancer patient, you want to know what makes sense to them and how that works for them and what life is for them. So that's where like the player journey, etc., also comes into. Again, in serious gaming, we also work a lot, not just with player experience, but with impact studies and clinical trials. Obviously, in entertainment versions, you don't have that. But a lot of the gaming studios now involve players much earlier than they used to really get that experience nailed down before the design team and the story team and the production team have gone too far. The earlier you can really make sure that where you're going, you're on a good path, the less it costs to make the game. And then, of course, there's the discussions with the design team, there's the discussions with the production team, with players, etc. And that results in revisions to your story and a lot of pages, a lot of changes probably. A lot of those will have to be done in very short time and very short notice. So the more you've done your preparation, like I said before you begin, if you know your characters, if you know, for example, my character would never say this in this or that situation, it makes your writing faster. So it's much easier for you then to do these revisions on the fly and very quick, especially if you still have other projects going on. And then, of course, when the game is done, basically what happens is you start the process over with next level, next release, etc. Are there any questions, anything like that at the moment?
There hasn't been anything that's popped up. Okay. I've got one, if you don't mind.
Sure.
You're talking about serious games, sort of starting with the audience. How do you hope to get as much out of the experiences of those people with personal difficulties whilst remaining compassionate and empathetic towards them? And how do you sort of deliver them or their their appearance in a serious game without coming across sort of condescending and perhaps like not getting
Yeah.
its tone right?
It's a very good question, and it's a very, very difficult question. So, if I can just give an example out of what I'm doing now, I'm currently writing on a TV pilot, and one of my main characters is transgender. Obviously, I cannot fathom what a transgender woman goes through. So I reach out. I've reached out to a couple of people. Fortunately, I have in my friends and network, I have a few people that have been through such an experience and that are living that life. And so I reach out to them, and I give them the characters, and I say, what do you think? Is this authentic? Is this on the nose? And this is also what we did with the game Shadow's Edge. We really, from the first drawing of the character, we involved the players and we asked them, what is this character? You have to have your questions ready then, right? So you have to know, what are you trying to ask? Are you trying to ask for the empathy? Are you trying to ask sort of the cause and effect? You really have to make sure you know your questions. What do you not know? What do you think you're comfortable with, and what do you not know? And then really fact check, research and fact check. The earlier, the better, because the more you already do, the easier it is to get offended, right? Let's imagine you're drawing somebody and that person does a certain action, and then you go and you verify it. You've gone into some time, some hours, some money, costs, etc. And B, you might offend the person further than if you'd actually involved them in the process at the beginning and said, look, we're trying to design a character. Here's what we're thinking. Now help me do this, basically. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Cedar's asked as well. You mentioned a few games with social missions earlier, dealing with ideas like depression and bullying, and cited them as games that are moving towards serious games. Where do you draw the line between thought-provoking art piece and a serious game?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, I don't think that if you take an example from movies again, Quentin Tarantino is too concerned with, being serious and getting his message across. He's more about provoking, right? So it depends a little bit on what you want to do, what your aim is as well. In general, if I make a serious game and I want to help teens overcome depression and anxiety, I don't want to be thought-provoking. If I want to just raise awareness for a topic like Black Lives Matter and people are just not getting it, I might want to be more thought-provoking, right? What I personally try to avoid is to go into certain stereotypes to try and provoke something, because that's just, even if I'm Dutch, right? And they say everybody in the Netherlands is open. Yes, and that's stereotype. We're also blunt. Yes. We have a strange sense of humor. Yes. However, I say yes, 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 but not all of the 17 million Dutch people living in the Netherlands are like that. And so I think trying to stereotype is just something that, in serious, if you're trying to get some points across, is not helpful. So it's better to try and get it across over storytelling, like have an action. Try to come with an action, like for example, in the Dutch case, do one of those bits of sense of humors and then have another character go, no, I really don't get it, and explain why, because then you can see what the cause and effect is. So those are kind of tricks and tools, devices, if you will, that you can play with.
Bruno's asked there as well, what is the main difference between writing for games versus movies, series and books that you've perhaps experienced?
So I can't say too much about books. I'm working on a business book. I've not done any fiction books. I can't say too much about there. In general, I think with books, you have more time. And I mean with more time, both you have more time to write it and you have more time with the reader, right? I believe, just from what I see also in my own experience and for what I hear and what people tell me, in a book, people will at some point, if it is a little bit boring, they'll skip a few pages. You just simply, you don't have that in a game or in a TV show or in a movie. People will turn it off or they'll just play something else. In a game, it's even worse because they can't even skip that level then, right? So if it becomes boring, it also becomes annoying, and if it becomes annoying, they don't want it anymore. So I think that's a big difference. The other thing is storytelling in books and movies is generally linear, and games, and I say generally because there are new media, right? There's 360 movies, there's VR movies, but generally in games you have more steps that user decides where to go. And so you have to be, it's like a jigsaw storytelling, if you will. You have to really make sure that you set your story points, and I'm talking a little bit about that in our example as well, so that you know that the things you want to get across. In a movie or in a TV show, you're the one that sets it, right? There's set points to tell a story. That's as old as storytelling, basically, where you have a beginning, a middle, and an end. At the very least, there's more story beats and points as well. That's a little bit too much to get into for this hour, but there's a set amount of pages and points that you have to hit at certain times for the story to work and for the user to not become bored. If, for example, in NCIS, you would have the case, the person that dies 50 minutes into the series, and in an hour it's over, and the first bit is just about explaining stuff, you know, then obviously that's not useful. And that's why a lot of these movies, etc., they really go to having that, what they call an inciting incident, really at the start. In a game, that's very much more difficult to place, because you have to make sure with the game mechanics, the design team, the leveling and everything, you know, what are the points that the player really hits? Where do they come across? And there you have to then make those decisions. That's where I place the things that they absolutely have to know about the character. They absolutely have to know about the story. And then the rest around it becomes, you know, what else could they know about the story? What else helps them to get through, if that makes sense.
Bruno said thank you for your answer, and so did Cedar.
And so for example, here, story versus experience, right? That's the whole point. You want to give them an experience. We tend to listen to story more than to lessons. Yes, I'm doing a lesson now, right? But if I tell a story, it's probably more entertaining than what I'm doing now. So if I were telling the story of a girl who was, you know, at age 5, telling herself her own bed stories because the environment at home was so terrible that that was her only method of escape, and that's why she started writing stories, which incidentally is my story, then that's probably more engaging, right? And so that's what you want to try to do with your story. Take them into that experience, create some empathy for the person, and really don't forget character is everything. And then also, once you have those points, I mean, it sounds easy, but there's also the social interaction, you know, in games, like in-game teams, for example, how they play with each other or how they talk to each other. Don't underestimate what an impact that can have on the experience of gameplay and how you can use that in your story. The same thing with competitions. If you have a game where people compete against each other, is there a story? Is there a reason why you're racing a car that makes it more empathetic, that makes it more real, if you will? And of course, the game mechanics. How difficult or easy do you want to make certain things? What kind of mechanics do you want to use? And keep them learning. Ralph Coston is a famous gaming guy, and he always said, you know, as long as they're learning, it's fun. So just get them to experience something new every once in a while. It's good.
So in these moments, Rosemary, a lot of games struggle to balance decisions and choices within those sort of experiences. How do you manage this, or how have you managed it in the past, and what sort of tips could you give to make these seem more authentic? Because a lot of them kind of remove that authenticity and sort of force a decision to be made, rather than there being like a decision process going on for the player.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. Now, I mean, just to take the point off first, I work on serious games, right? So my whole experience in storytelling is really trying to get the story across that helps people develop something. Like, for example, in this one here, with Shadow's Edge, which you see here, the point was to help people understand themselves better, reflect upon themselves, and help them tell their own story so that they become an active agent of their own story, which would help improve their mental health. Now, there's a couple of things that I think are really important as a writer. I don't believe, even in my fictional stories, I don't believe that I know it all, or that I have that whole story in my head. I really go out to people. And so, for example, in this case, we really used psychologists. We looked and we researched into narrative therapy. We did market research on teens because that was our audience. And then we looked at who can we involve to actually get this game made. And so in this case, we involved over 500 teens in the first process step already to figure out, how can we tell this better? What if is that story of a city, does that make sense? Does that make you feel like, your home, or should it be a house? Should it really ask all those questions? Use people you have around you as a sounding board, and take those notes and really allow it to make your story better. I think specifically with characters, that's something, I believe that authenticity in world and environment is not that necessary, as long as you have the rules explained and the rules of the world. Like, for example, think of vampire stuff in movies, right? In Twilight, no idea why people fizzle when they get bit, right? You see kind of starry bits. In Vampire Wars, they become a vampire because there's a virus, and so then they can move about during the day. They don't burn up, and so all of these rules, if you explain those rules and really make sure that they're there, then we buy into them, and then we fit into that world. So the more authentic you can make those rules, and then make that fit within your world, your story, your character, so that it's consistent, the better people actually feel that it's authentic. Now, one step more, you make a good point as well. If you want to get a serious game across, I see tons of games that want to talk about depression, and then what they do is they put the person in an insane asylum. That's a bit on the nose. Again, we're stereotyping here, right? So not everybody that is depressed or that has a mental illness actually needs to go into some kind of insane asylum. So I think taking real world examples that are maybe a little bit trickier to tell, like of a normal person, everyday person struggling with something, that's in the end more rewarding and makes it more authentic, but it's also obviously a little bit more tricky, because it's you have to do more research, more work, more rewriting potentially, and take notes from others.
Fantastic answers, Rosemary. I'm watching this like entertainment more than what I am education at the moment.
Well, that's the point, right? We want to entertain. That's the point, right? Depending on the subject, you could also just tell this story of somebody that got to these conclusions. So I do that sometimes in speeches as well. Here you ask me to focus a little bit more on the process as well, so that it becomes a little bit more nitty gritty. But I also wanted to just give an example. So I'm using Shadow's Edge because it's quite timely. People have often this year, we've really had a lot of feedback on the game because of COVID, and it looks like, like for example, level 1 in our game looks like March around the world, basically. Level 2 is kind of what some areas are still in, and then level 3 is kind of what some areas like Switzerland were going back to normal, and so that's sort of what it looks like. So we've got 3 levels in the game. And that's something that really matches the real world. Now, we developed the game 5 years ago, so we didn't know that was going to happen. But I thought it might be an interesting case to just showcase this, because it has a lot of elements really from psychology, and a lot of elements from chronic illnesses, and etc. So it's a bit of a trickier game than an entertainment game to tell. So our story is the story of a game that's been a world that's been hit by a storm. So this is sort of the concept that I mentioned before. How do you make this? You start with, like, what's the backstory? What's the story? What do you want in serious games? You always ask the design question: what do you want to achieve with your story, with your game? And then the story itself, of course, and you want to see what the output is. What do you want people to walk away with, basically? I do this also in any kind of storytelling. It's a good thing anyways, because that if you know what you want to get across, you can really try and see and nail those points, right? That's a bit like moving through a story in a movie. You've got, as I said, a beginning, a middle, and an end. If you know what the end of your beginning is and how you get into that middle part, then you know what you're working towards. And it's a little bit the same in games. Even though people make their own decisions, there's still things that you, as the storyteller, whether you're a designer or a producer, but the people that make the game, you want to get something across, even in an entertainment game, more so even in a serious game. And so it's good to think about those things. So for our purposes, we had we wanted to reach out to teens and young adults, and we knew that we wanted to get self-help content to them, similar to what we had in an existing book of the foundation. It was a journaling book. It was based on narrative therapy, but teens don't really read many books anymore if they can avoid it, and so we wanted to get something that was more entertaining and puts them more into an active role of building their story and building resilience in themselves. So the focus of the game is to build resilience, to become mentally stronger through playing the game. And you do that by telling your story, basically. Because in narrative therapy, what it says is every time you tell your story, you tell it a little bit different. And the reason you tell it a little bit different is because you're actually starting to accept things. You're starting to reflect on things, and you're starting to accept them without noticing, but they become part of you. And as they become part of you, it becomes easier to have those elements within you. And then it becomes easier to actually live with them. And so that makes you more resilient. The theme of this was resilience. We really wanted to build resilience. Now, the question obviously is, how do you do that? And so before we even started with the game, we really looked at what is resilience? What are the factors of resilience? What do people have to feel and do to become resilient? And we did a study with the Dutch University of Twente, as well as we got a little grant from the Dutch government. And we did a little study on there that we then, after the beta, also did a full impact study with. But we did a study first on what is resilience. And we found that there's a couple of factors that make people more resilient. One is, for example, optimism. The second one is a positive self-identity, self-confidence, if you will. And then another one is to be able to recognize what you're going through and start earlier on managing what you're going through. There's more factors, but those three we saw were something that we thought the game could really impact. And so that became our design question. How do we create this tool make it a learning tool so that they can work on that, become more strong, and do so in a safe and fun place? Because if they don't feel safe, they're not going to do it. And if it's not fun, most likely it feels like homework. And then, it's same as therapy, then it becomes homework. And so that's what we wanted to achieve. And so we came up with a story, a world, a design that all kind of goes into the metaphor of, okay, something happens in my life, and now my life is not what it was before. It can be shattered, or it can just simply be overwhelming. It can be anything, right? And the story that we felt got that best across is that it's a city that's been hit by a storm, an external factor, and somebody has to help me save that for these purposes. So we initially created this for people that have chronic and serious illnesses. Later on, we widened the scope, but at the beginning, we really worked with people that have cancer, Lyme disease, diabetes, amputees, trauma, etc., to look at, does this work? Does this make sense? And if you see the world on the side there, on the right-hand side, that was what we came up with first with this fantasy world. And then what the players told us more and more is like, no, it needs to be in the real world. It needs to feel really like what I am going through, so that I can take that learning back into my real life. So that players had a large impact from the very first design already.
Were there any factors that allowed you sort of to differentiate between whether the game was becoming homework or whether it was an experience that was worthwhile for the players?
We did that through a lot of studies. So we had the first beta release in 2017, and ever since then we've kept up, releases. Basically every month we do a small update with different things, with new functions, with new things that the players asked for. Also with backend stuff, more analytics, so that we can figure out better, where players get stuck and what they can do and why and how. But the key point I think for that is at the beginning we work with psychologists to get all the metaphors right in the game, because this whole game is filled with metaphors, from what you'll see it in a couple of the pictures, but from what the characters wear, to the street names, to the levels, everything is filled with metaphors of going through a journey of emotional healing. And we did a series of studies internally where we did, so for example, we did the impact study after the beta. We had 55 people with chronic diseases, etc., play the game through at the beginning for 6 weeks, basically. 3 times a week, 20 minutes is what we mandated. They could do more if they wanted to. And we had a beginning survey and an end survey. Those two surveys looked at scales of anxiety and depression, but more importantly, they also looked at, you know, factors of resilience. Did they feel more optimistic? What parts in the game made them feel optimistic? Where were they stuck and why were they stuck? Was it, as you say, you know, was it something that was just not fun? Was it boring? Did they want to keep playing? And all those things we looked at as well. We also, of course, look at retention numbers and analytics. Where do people jump off? And then figure out, you know, try to figure out. A lot of it's a guessing game in the first couple of steps. Try to figure out, you know, why do they jump off? Like, for example, we had a tutorial and we had 70% of people jump off. And so now we spread out the tutorial and we really made it part of the mission and the quest to learn how to do things. And that helped a lot. And so all of these kinds of things, you work with your audience and then ask them, you know, how can we make this more interesting? We also did pure play tests where we filmed them and saw where they went like, yeah, no. And so there's a lot of reactions like that you can take from those as well. And we also did psychological tests with psychologists. So we had in-depth interviews where psychologists would take place and really see, okay, what did you take out of this session? If you played 5 minutes versus if you played 20 minutes, how did that make you feel? What was the difference? If I had given you this to do, like a drawing to do in real life on paper in my session, how would you react versus, you know, having played this? Now that you've done this, how do you now feel about the therapy session we had? All those kinds of questions. So there's tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of research that goes into it.
Is that research publicly available at all, or is it?
Some, I mean, to be very honest, we just haven't written everything up publicly yet.
It sounds like it would take a long time.
We're a team of 10 people, right? The designers, we have a design. So we don't develop the game, and the design and development comes from an external studio. But we're the ones that telling them how, what, etc. And then obviously it's a back and forth, right? A constant back and forth with the little chicken game company they're called, on, you know, what to do, how to do it, etc. So we have one person on our team dedicated pretty much to that, to really do the research and then feed it back in. We call it the game loop, feed it back into the product and vice versa. We have a couple of stuff on the studies available that I can send you, like outcomes, how long they played, etc. But all that detailed stuff from like all the interview questions and things like that, we just haven't written that up yet. It's on our to-do list.
I'm gonna have to keep in touch with you then as much as possible. That sounds extremely interesting. Seed has asked another question, if you don't mind. Do you think presenting a serious game as a serious game, as opposed to just a game, hurts its chances of getting its message across? Is this something that you should be considered when presenting it to a potential player?
For sure. Absolutely. We came with this game, the quest was to build a serious game, right? And it was a foundation focused on building resilience and mental health. So, you know, for that, obviously we had the funding because of that, right? A lot of stuff, we got a lot of money from grants. So they're also really making it a serious game, and marketing as such, absolutely helpful. To get your player base, not so helpful. You know, yes, people. So there's two things. One is getting the game out there for a lot of people. Putting it out there as a serious game, maybe not so helpful. But then again, you also have to figure out who do you want to help. And we wanted to help people that have anxiety issues, that are depressed, that feel out of place, that may feel, you know, different than others and don't know how to cope with that. People that are just feeling mentally a little bit under the weather and weak, or you know, bored or something like that. We wanted to help like a wide variety of people, but people that really wanted to work on their mental health, and that thought maybe things like Calm and Headspace and whatever were just like homework, right? And so we wanted to reach them with a medium they're comfortable in, that's fun, that doesn't look like they're working on their mental health. So that was important. And so that became, for us, more important than having a volume. So on the App Store, for example, and all those kinds of things, you know, you will see we do use self-help, we use anxiety, we use depression as a word, mental health. It doesn't help us get to like huge player numbers, but it helps us get the people that we want to help, basically. So we've got 35,000 players only. It's not that much if you're thinking, but considering that it's 35,000 people that actually have a positive mental health outcome because of it, that's more important for us than the masses. But for sure, for investment, you're not going to go to a publisher and say, I have a serious game, I aim to help 35,000 people, right? It's not going to work. So it depends on who funds you, it depends on what market you want, and it really depends on what is your personal aim with that game. If you wanted to make it more entertaining, like I Hope or Concrete Genie, great. They raise awareness for the topics, but they didn't get into that step of actually helping people then deal with it, in my opinion, having played those games.
There's a lot of topics, serious games. Olivia's asked, since we experience a lot of political tension right now, do you think games could be used to push political agendas in the future?
Absolutely.
Do you think they will influence people's views on political matters like they do with mental health issues?
Absolutely. I mean, there is a couple, and more games like this exist, right? So I'm on the committee of like serious play, for example, where I judge new games that people submit for serious games. I'm on the committee of the Edison Innovation Award, where I judge anything that comes through in games, because Edison is like product, any product in the world, any innovation. And so I see stuff coming through more and more, and I think it's exciting. It's really cool. 5-6 years ago, when I entered this serious space, it was more, what I saw was more simulations for like teaching people specific things like surgeons or nurses or stuff like that. It was simulations for military, for example, a lot, which in its way is great, right? I mean, the military has, over the last 100 years, has paid for a lot of inventions that we have now, right? So, we don't want to, Teflon pans were, used first in military, then in aerospace, and then in our kitchen. So there's a ton of stuff that comes out of military, but it was very one-sided. Right? What they wanted and what they need, it's very one-sided. And more now, I see games come that really try to make an environmental difference, for example, like Mission 1 is a UK-based game where they look at environmental policies, and then the audience, the players get to try and figure out certain things and then vote, and they can see what their votes and what then passing certain things like bills actually does to the environment. So if collectively players make a certain decision, then the rainforest dies and all those kind of things. So I see a lot of awareness raising games, and I think that can go even a step further. Child of War as well, for example, is about children that were in the war but not victims. They were the children of the people that actually killed people, right? And it's an important story for them, because they can't really, it wasn't their fault, and yet they have difficult lives because of what their parents did. And so, raising awareness is step one for those kind of things, but I think games can go much further and actually help people live through situations. I'm consulting on a refugee game, for example, at the moment, and we followed real children that actually that fled from their country, and we followed them sort of on their trip through Europe to try and get to a place. And there we're now working on something that where we give the player the power to then decide what to do if they run into, for example, authorities, or what the player does when going to a new country and not knowing the language and all those kinds of things. And so I think there's so many more opportunities. It's a question of creativity, and that's, I think, what's really exciting for me. I see this in movies too. There's more and more movies that want to get a point across and not just entertain. And I think that that's also something that we see in games, even mainstream games, right? In Zelda, where you have to talk somebody off a ledge. In World of Warcraft, where there's the diabetes room that you have to get through, and all your symptoms are exactly like when you have diabetes. I think politicians also, and politics is a very, very, I don't know anything about it. I have to be very honest. I've successfully avoided Trump for 4 years. It's amazing. I think I'm the only person that's managed to do that. But it's yes, absolutely. I believe anything that people can learn, you could gamify or make into a game.
As part of that, Dominique's actually asked, when writing choices within the stories, most popular end up rather linear. How do you think that you can avoid this when writing a game with choices for its characters?
Yeah. Okay. That's a really good one. So what I like to try and do in that case is I call that a story map. Sort of like a fork in the road. Imagine you have a Google map, but when you stand at the start of it, all you can see is the next maybe mile. And you know that you want to go, I'm just saying something, to Paris, but all you know is the next mile, right? Now, what you want to do, what you want to try and do as a storyteller is you want to be always 1 mile ahead of the person that plays the game. So when I stand at the beginning of my road to Paris and I see 1 mile ahead, then the storyteller actually knows after that mile, what's the purpose? Do I want them to go left or right? And then you start splitting that up, and that turns into like a whole match. There's actually a good case story. I believe they also do it in a YouTube video, a speech from SimCity, and what happens when people make choices and how that happened and how that sort of got away from them, and really created too much choice and to get across what they wanted to get across. That's really a neat one to actually look at. I think it's on YouTube as well. But try to think backwards would be my my suggestion. Come up with everything that could happen, and then start narrowing it down and see where people have to make choices to get to whatever you want them to happen, or to get to everything, right? Maybe your game is about learning everything about the environment and you want them in the end to have hit all of those points. So try to get your goals and then narrow it down would be my suggestion, to get to that 1 mile that I as a player can see. That make sense?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Dominic says thank you so much.
And it's a bit tricky, right? Because it implies you have to know your whole story. And that's why I said before you even start, just, I make a full concept if I write something. I write the whole full thing. But I know when I'm writing that probably 80% of it's going to be thrown away. But you have to start somewhere, because if you don't know your end game, and that's why in the first draft, I spell check. I always spell check, because that's a pet peeve of so many people that I know, that it becomes a stumbling block. So I always spell check, but and grammar and stuff. But if it works, if my plans and payoff don't always hit or anything, that's not that important in a first draft. In a first draft, it's really important to get to a map where you say, okay, here are the points that we really liked in this, here are the points we don't like in it, and now how do we, the ones that we really liked, how do we keep those, and how do we bring people to that endpoint? And so that's why you start working backward, and you can't work backward if you don't have the end goal, right? So just a few story elements. I was talking about story elements that you have before, right? You have in games, of course, you've got a lot more than you have in movies. In movies, you've got the environment, the world, etc. as well. But in games, there's so much more you can do also with, what people wear, for example. In a movie, you would have a character, she's dressed a certain way, and that character generally stays dressed that certain way throughout the movie. In You and Me, for example, Me Before You or You Before Me, whatever the movie's called, she's quirky, 1950s dressed with strange socks. She's not going to suddenly wear a business suit and look nice and neat. That would be against character. In a game, you can do that, because if you have the rule that in a different level, she wouldn't even have those clothes, and it's just not possible, or she has to make that change because otherwise her personality won't change enough to be able to master the mechanics of that level, then you've got a costume change. You've got a complete personality change if necessary. So there's so much more in games that you can do than you do than that's possible in movies, I think. So a couple of the elements that we've used just in story, we've named, if I'm going top right, we've named the streets according to graffiti. In our story, what we do is you have to save the story from the storm, and you do that by writing, so narrative therapy, and you do that by creating graffiti, which is artistic expression. Artistic expression helps a certain part of your brain come to terms with things and see things differently. Even if you can't draw, it doesn't matter. We have stickers, we have, stencils, Banksy-like and whatever. And then writing comes more from the other side of the brain and really helps you reflect, and helps you communicate and put into words what you want to do. And it's all about practice. It's about the first time you talk about your feelings is going to be really awkward, but there are ways that you can practice that. There are ways that you can put things into your diary that will then help you enough over time to be able to also express those to others. And so those are the two elements. And now, from a gaming perspective, everything that you do, every work you do, every bit on yourself that you work actually brings the city back to life. So plants will start growing, creatures will come back, the weather will change. As you level up, bigger changes will happen, etc. And so in here, a lot of the storytelling that we have is metaphors. Gridway is something that you say in street art. So we consulted a street artist, and he looked at our players. First thing he said is nobody that is on the east side would ever wear those types of shoes if they're a graffiti artist. So, you know, those kinds of things, stuff pops up, right? And then we have the street names and things like that. We have actual dialogue, obviously, as you can see here in The Guardian. But what you can see here more, it's more than just the dialogue, right? Yes, we have some of the story reveal in here. The storm stopped everything. He's explaining the characters explaining the quest. But there's much more in here. We've used browns and reds because they signify anger. And in the first stage, when something happens in your life, you come into denial and anger, right? The denial part is signified by the glasses and by having his cap over his head, and you know, not really identifying is it a he or a she, those kinds of things. And so there's a lot of metaphors in there. The storm, you know, quite physically, we put, as you can see in the background here, we put the storm elements in there by having stuff still flying around. And part of the storyline is that time froze, and that the city was split into three different levels, and that's what you have to go through. You have to fix those levels, for example. And so you can show those with story elements. Part of those billboards and those flying around seats, etc., then become part of your story. Why does it, you know, why is it the way it is? Why wasn't there a storm and everything just looks wrecked, basically? Then we have certain exercises that we have, like here on the right hand side, you have to find these pigeons that have wisdom to give. In the story element there also, you know, the animals help you because they're the first ones that come back to the city before people can come back. So if you want help, that's who you go to. And the phoenix actually, the pigeon actually imagines himself as a phoenix. And so there's a story in there, you know, why is that the case? And what does the phoenix signify? And then if you look closer into the game, the character Ty had a brother, and the brother actually, his favorite animal was a phoenix. And so there's a connection there. So you can do so much with story just from that one pigeon and just from that one character. And then, of course, there's the obvious. Yeah, sorry.
Can I just ask, dialogue can be difficult to get right. How do you juggle with delivering what you want to communicate as a writer, but staying succinct as well to keep the player's attention?
Yeah, I mean, some of it is, as a writer, you try to see what you think you could get through. So, I mean, there's exercises you can do, and there's all kinds of stuff. I usually just really start with character and see, you know, what do I want to get across? I mean, you have to have a goal, right? What do you want to get across? Then you look at who could get that across. Is it dialogue? Is it, you know, what part of the world, what part of it can you get across? And this is, by the way, this is not just gaming. At the moment, as I said, I'm writing a TV pilot, and it's an AI, an hologram, emotional artificial intelligent woman, and she, even if it's an it, but I call her a she because for me it's a character. She becomes the lead agent of a special FBI team that solves cases in the gaming world. And so the first case is about blowing up an esports stadium. In the beginning, what you have to do is you have to really figure out, okay, how do I get across that Kenya, that AI, is who she is, and you know, what can she do and what can she not do, what's possible. So you look at what's realistic, but even more so, you know, you look at things like, if I want to reveal her humor, but she's a computer, she can't have that much humor at the beginning, right? She can only have humor later. So what kind of jokes really fit at the beginning? What could she do? How could she learn from others? And if she's learning and she learns a joke and she learns how to make jokes and she becomes more human over time, who does she learn from? I have to put somebody next to her that actually is funny, because otherwise how would she learn, right? And so it's a combination. Once you know who is involved and what's involved, and you kind of know the timing of it, when do I need to, you know, when does she crack her first joke, for example, then you can come up with who says it and who helps her. And then you start coming up with the dialogue itself. Only if you look at why you're doing it, that's the most important question you can always ask yourself in any story. Why am I telling this? And what's the point I want to get across? Only if you do that, then you can put the joke in there. If that makes sense.
Yeah, a lot of stories sort of focus on generating these characters and making them likable. I've always been more interested in sort of the memorable good bad guys. Um, have you
Yeah,
got any
yeah,
tips
but those
about
are characters
you
too.
know?
Those are characters too, right? Bad guys.
Yeah, I think it's just like I've always thought that there's a lot more that goes into sort of, or it seems more difficult to make a good bad guy, as opposed to sort of making someone likable. I don't know
I
what
don't
your
know.
thoughts
I mean, honestly, for me, it's easier. I think that making a good guy can become very boring and one-sided. Um, I mean, just think of what makes us like people in a good person, right? Is it that they always help their neighbors? Is it that they drink the coffee we like? Is it that they dress a certain way? I mean, they're classic things. But in a bad guy, you can do so much more. You know, there's so much more creativity involved because you can really work with contrasts. In a good girl, there's not that many contrasts. Yes, you work with the flaw, right? You try and see that the character has a flaw, that they're not good at something, because otherwise they're also not likable. And this is the thing. You can make them too likable, and then people won't like them anymore. Is kind of the point, if you know what I mean. So they have to be a little bit of a baddie too, because otherwise they're not multidimensional enough. So, and I find that personally a little bit more difficult. What's the flaw that actually helps people like them versus in a bad guy? What makes you like a bad guy? If one classic one is you think they're redeemable, right? The second classic is, well, he's got a point or she's got a point. Yes, they're bad, but they've got a point. So there's certain things you can play with that are just much bigger, I think, than with a good person. And I mean, there's different things. So when I wrote a rom-com, and again, also something with action in it and stuff. I also always write stuff about tech, because I'm a woman in tech, so that's what I do. Write about what you know. And so I had this teacher that pointed out to me in my first scene of the movie that if I just changed one very, very, very little thing, it would have completely changed the way people look at my character. And I've never forgot that lesson. So in the first scene there, you've got it's a computer simulation. There's a woman that runs a computer simulation of breaking into an FBI office, and they're simulating how easy that is, basically to show the FBI, well, we can crack you. And so they break in with plastic machine guns and all kinds. Don't want to give anybody ideas, but they're breaking in with machine guns and all kinds of stuff. And I had in there that the main character, the woman, was leading the show and she was directing people there, etc., etc. And then basically I had somebody just shoot around and kill everybody in the building, and that was a glitch in the software, if you will. But the teacher said, well, why don't you have her shoot everybody? Because it gives her a reckless streak. And that actually now makes me believe everything she does later in the movie, because she does have that reckless streak. And it's such a simple, it's such a simple change. It took one sentence to rewrite it. Instead of Will shoots everybody, it's she shoots. Obviously, I did a little bit more funny than she shoots everyone, but it's such a simple change. And I think looking for those small changes that you can have your characters do that makes their actions believable, that's really important. I'm still working on that too. I mean, I get feedback from, my manager and other people all the time, and there's stuff that I can improve that I don't see that other people see. Or I had a character drink a lot of coffee, and all I wanted to say was, constantly working in a startup, etc. And people said, she favors Starbucks. I mean, she's so mainstream and so dull. I'm like, what? It's like so not what I wanted to say with that. And so, it's always good to ask other people what they see in what you wrote, I think. But try to find those small points, those small things. If you can make a change and it makes it better, great. If you can't make any changes, also great. If you think there is a change and you can't make the change, then there's something wrong with your plot. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Oscar's just asked as well, when you're writing characters, how do you usually go about setting up major character development?
Everybody does it a little bit different, so I can only speak from my perspective. I like knowing everything about my characters because it makes my writing easier afterwards. So there are certain things that you do a character description, and in a character description, classically, what you want to know is obviously their age, their gender or gender identity, whatever it is. You want to know a little bit about their personality. You want to write a little bit about what their journey in the movie or in the game is. You know, like where do they start, where do they end, what do they learn. So that's a general bit. I like really knowing stuff about my characters. What movies does my character like? You know, where is that character going? Or if it's a fictional character in a fictional world, let's say like a game, for example, I have another refugee game that I did a concept for, never came to place, but I did a concept for it, and I really like the main character. I like to write women as main characters if it's my own stories, just to take this off because it's just write about what you know. Obviously, if I do it for customers like here, Thai and other things, I don't. But I bring up more women just because I've written more stuff that I just write and then sell rather than create for other people. So in that, there was a refugee called Indira, and she came from a foreign country. And there, I really liked knowing, what was life like there for her? What kind of toys did she have when she grew up? Was there something that in her past that she didn't like, or that she was scared of? Are there things that she hates? What foods, what drinks, everything basically, right? It helps me later on really be able to put the character in a situation and not have to think about it. So in my movie, for example, I know how Agent Caldera, how he reacts if there's somebody shooting at him, because I know what Agent Caldera is like. He would curse and then he would just run straight for it. If I put Agent Banks in that situation, he would run away and he would think, okay, how can I get back up? What do I do? And where do I get strength from, basically? And so the more you know about your characters, I find the faster you are then able to write once really you get going. But again, it's always, that's a lot of work at the beginning. That's a lot of work on structure that I do at the beginning. Not everybody does that. I know people that just write. I like knowing that what I write has a point, and so therefore the faster that then makes me later on, the better I've done my preparation.
I love the passion that comes across. Working as a writer, and you must mean that you have to work with a designer too. What are the main frustrations for you working between being a writer and trying to bring it into a game perspective?
That's a good question. Timing, a lot of times. Whereas designers get a lot of time to design their characters, and they need, right? They need a lot of time, especially if you animate stuff, etc. I usually get changes, and then there's like, oh, can we have those tomorrow morning? And I'm like, you do realize that changes like everything in Act 1 and Act 2 and Act 3. But it's just, you have those deadlines, and that's also why I do more preparation, so that I know what the person would do. Here, Ty, I know if we now change the storm, I know what Ty would say, right, and why. And so that makes it a lot easier. If there's new features and functions, a lot of times I get involved when they've already thought them up. When they already know what they're doing. Like, for example, now here in this game, we've built in you can see this on the left, we've built in a new messaging system where these guardians actually teach you how to do certain things in drawing, how to do certain things in meditation. We've put mindfulness exercises in there. Those mindfulness exercises are currently not linked to story at all. Why would that character do a mindfulness exercise to get a city to be better? There's no reason, you know what I mean? There's no point. And so we didn't have time for me to come up with a point before we implemented it. In this next round, I actually make a point out of it, right? I make the point that as the city is growing, just like you would weed your garden, that's what you do with yourself as well. You try, she's getting ready. She wants her family to see how much she's grown. And that's why she's doing these meditation and all these things that she's learned. Also, she wants to know more about herself so that she can tell her family. And so, in hindsight, you can change anything in hindsight, but it's frustrating sometimes if you are the one that basically comes up with the story idea, and then others take it and you're not involved.
How do you be more flexible with that then, considering that you said the amount of changes you'd have to make to the structure that you have preliminarily?
I think that there's certain things, I mean, it's a fine balance. There's certain things that I'm refusing. We're not changing. It is a storm. And if it now becomes, I don't know, I'm just saying something, a social emotional learning tool for general mental health versus chronic illness, we're not taking out the storm because the whole story is based on it. And so, and even if you are that sounds really, really wrong, but even if you're not feeling good, or you've missed high school graduation because of COVID, it's still a little bit like a storm, right? It might not be a huge storm, but for you, that problem is still real. So I'm not changing that. So you have to have that fine balance of what are the things that are not changeable to get your points across, and what are the things that really don't matter that much. Do I really care if the pigeon says expressing feelings can be the way out, or if you don't express your feelings, you're never going to get out of the situation? I don't care, right?
Yeah, definitely. Dominique's asked a question. What programs would you recommend for writing scripts and novels?
Again, that depends on what you're writing for. In games, I often just use a database, because a lot of times the way that the text gets imported into a game is either a SQL database or a Google Sheet or an Excel file or something like that. If I already work in that, then it already gives me the limitations of, like for example, here on The Guardian, you can see that there's a certain size that box is. So it gives me that already, right? Because in gaming, I have to fit into a bit of dialogue as well. And yes, I can press next, but it still has to fit. And by the way, it has to fit in bloody 8 languages, which is not fun. So that's another thing to just think about. But yeah, Spanish words are so long. Oh. So, those kind of things. So that's why databases work quite well. And that's why storyboarding for me becomes very visual. I mentioned the little things that Rob has on his wall. I have a blackboard here with magnets and stuff like that where I storyboard, for me, just because it's visually nice for me. But a lot of times we do that in the team online. So we use like, I don't know, Mural. There's a thing called Design Board. There's other tools that do basically the same thing. It's a bunch of sticky notes and quadrants that have text, basically, right? And then you can add like arrows to it to sort of show sequence. So that's one thing. If it's more linear writing, like for example the business book, or even like the TV pilots and movies, for example, then I use Final Draft. It's what the industry uses. Yes, there are others like MovieScript and others, but Final Draft is what people use, and there you have all the formatting in there. I mean, I can show some of the formatting if that even helps. We've covered a lot of this actually, so I could probably take this off. If you do, for example, my current script this is what formatting looks like for a movie script or a TV script. They're pretty much the same, except for length. TV is 55 to 60 pages, and then movies are max 120, except if you're Aaron Sorkins, then it's 400 pages, but I'm not. So, so this is what it looks like. Basically, you have your scene setup, you have your action that you then do, and then you have your dialogue, basically, right? And that's pretty much it. There's little things of being off screen, or if it's really important that they're slow or whatever, then you write that. But this is what it looks like, and all this formatting is in here. So for example, if I now press enter, it'll assume that now there's an action because I've had a bunch of dialogue, right? And with one click, I can say, if I press enter again, then I can choose, no, actually, this is the one. And it'll go to the actual point that the script people wanted in. And so that's just a lot easier. Can you do it in Word or in a Google? Yeah, absolutely. But here it's easier because this is the format that they expected in the end. And that's what needs to happen. In the case of, for example, the game Shadow's Edge, we've done it in Excel. And here you have all the elements in there, like as you can see, even the credits, right? So you have like sort of game elements. I'll go a little bit I'll make it a little bit bigger as well, so it's easier to see. Now you can start seeing how complicated it is in a game, right? Because we've got like pop-up text and things. These are things that would be on like buttons or the recurring things like okay, or things that are in the menu, like in the registration menu and those kinds of things. That's all game related basically. And then as you can see, we've got this in many languages, right? So then every time I change something here, I have to change it everywhere, and that's why it's easier for me in an Excel file, because I know I can just go all the way through. Then we have the psychological content, which is this. These are all the questions you find, the therapeutical questions you find in the game. And you can see that here we've marked, I hope you guys can see that, but you can see that here you've marked like what's the keys. Now, honestly, we could have gone a little bit better than missing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in hindsight, but that's something we can't answer anymore now. So we've added like what phase it's in and what block, so that I know where it is and I don't have to play the game 600 times to change something. Then there's the page title. If somebody comes it up, there's a question, short question, and a longer version of it. And that, again, in every language, right? The nice thing here also is I can set this then to a certain width. And then I know that if I do something in Dutch or in another language, then it actually cuts it that way too, and I can see immediately where I'm going wrong. Same thing with the wisdoms. This is the pigeon stuff that I showed you before, right? That's what the pigeon says, and the locations of it. And then we've got the dialogue, basically. So here it gets a little bit more complicated even, because you have where it is. You've got sort of repetitive things, which are up top here. And then here we go according to phase and where we see it. So A is disruption, B is disruption, and then C gets into disillusionment. So we have these gaming unity locations, and then we match it with our location so we know which part of the city it's in. And then there's things that you see, we call them greetings, but that's what you see. That's not what the Guardian says, but you see it somewhere. And then we have what the character says, again, in all of the languages, right? And we've started now sort of mapping where do we think. We've done that in Dutch just because our team is Dutch and I'm Dutch, and so we start in Dutch and then we go to English and others. But we've now started mapping. I've now started mapping where do I need to make changes because of all the new functions. Where do the new functions not fit the story anymore? And you can see that this is something I'm just working on in the next 4 weeks. So we've just released it. The story doesn't fit. I now have 3-4 weeks to fix it, which is great that I have that long. Normally I don't, but you can see there's quite a few things that I need to change, right? And the first element is just figuring out what do I need to change. And then I color coded, like blue is just, okay, the dialogue doesn't fit in anymore. Orange is this doesn't really fit in the story even. And yellow is it doesn't fit to the character anymore. Right, so that you color code it. But then Excel allows me to have that all in one place. If this was a Word document, it would be bloody long, and I wouldn't have any of the other languages, and I wouldn't have the checkpoints, right? If that makes sense. And then we have the same thing for the exercises and the messaging.
Which of the languages was the most difficult?
Well, English is just impossible. So Hindi is just, we just had somebody translate it. I speak the other languages. So for me, German is tricky because it's, as you can see just here, look, we're saying the same thing. This is English, this is German. And it's about the same width of the box, right? These two. So you can see it's a lot longer. So that's tricky, making it short enough.
It's really time consuming because of the different meanings behind words and.
Yep, and then you have like Spanish and Portuguese that are very similar, but one word could mean something completely different. I had this once in Portugal. I was reading a book, and then it said "Siéntame do pé," which means literally "come sit on my foot." And so I asked one of the people in my team. I said, "I don't know what is this? Is this like kinky or something?" They're in a morgue, and she's asking her brother-in-law to sit on her foot. And he's like, no, that just means sit next to me. I'm like, nope, that does not, no.
That didn't translate well.
So all these subtleties, with localization, we're lucky that we have people on our team that do all of this, because that normally I really would if you have the money, I really would recommend going to a localization agent, because it's really tricky sometimes. Even with Portuguese, what Portuguese do you do? Portuguese or Brazil, right? So that it's just, I mean, this just 2 examples of tools that I use. It depends a bit on the complexity as well, of course.
Thank you very much for showing
Right.
everybody. It's not very often that we get to see things like that.
Yeah, and then I mean the other thing with Indira, for example, I really used Word, but that was because the game was meant to be more about her story, so I just wrote her story first. In the end, I should have used Final Draft just because of the formatting, because there was a lot of dialogue in there as well. So it depends a little bit on, it depends on what you need. There's different tools out there. Even you can even write stuff. Oh, that doesn't look good. I'll stop screen sharing for a minute. You can even write directly into some of these game development tools, like Unreal Engine has like a place where you could do that. The reason I don't like doing that is because as a writer, these stories, when I'm in them, I live with them, right? I mean, I literally go on a dog walk and I think, oh, that's what she should do. And then I don't have anything with me, and then I have to log into Unity, and then, or I have to make a note somewhere, and so I like doing things that I can actually, where there's a version on my phone where I can enter, where I can react quickly, but that's really just me. If I have tons of time and I'm just doing the project for myself, like I'm writing a drama about, I have been writing a drama for like 2 years. This is what I mean with I have plenty of time, about a sick little girl that's 11 years old. Then I like doing it on my Blackboard, and every day I walk past it and I just keep thinking about it. But it's not moving because I don't have deadlines. So everything else comes first, which is a bit of the tricky bit, right? It becomes very tricky when you do multiple things at the same time. That's tricky.
Do you have tips for managing that sort of thing?
Yeah, I wish. I mean, if you guys have tips, I'd love to.
I mean,
I'm stuck
I
in.
use Agile myself.
I tend to become my lead character. No problem. We'll get to you, Joshua. Well, I like to become my characters, at least the main characters. When I'm in there, and it's really freaky sometimes because, for example, on the TV pilot, the reason I started was the AI Kenya, right? And now I find that the person that handles her, because she's a hologram, so somebody actually has to put her in the room that she has to search for, and somebody has to wear a device to look around, because obviously a hologram can't look around and scan the room, right? For example. And so now I'm identifying with Iz, but who's her handler? But Iz is transgender. I cannot identify, and so it becomes really tricky. And at the same time, I'm writing about a little girl that's 11 years old, which is also not me. So that becomes very tricky. So what I try to do, it's not working yet because I'm in the gaming world and at the same time doing these other projects. I'd love to do one project after the other. That would be helpful. Not working for me.
Managing everything,
but that I think would help.
On as well must be so difficult.
Yeah. So Joshua had a question, I think.
Yes. Says, hey, what is your opinion as someone writing about a character that is different to them to make a political point? An example, a white person creating a black character to discuss things like Black Lives Matter and racism in the modern world. If okay, what should the writer do to make the characters better, and when does the style of the character creation become problematic?
Excellent set of questions. So I'll say what my literary manager said, because I was writing Is a transgender. I mean, first of all, in any point, I would talk to people that are your character or that could potentially be your character, and ask them some questions like, what are things that, not ask them like, how would you write this character necessarily, but ask them, what would you avoid, right? What's a classic? What would upset you if you see that person on screen? Right? That's a quick thing. And you can find people online. There's writers groups. There's all kinds of stuff. I mean, there's so many people out there now. And people are generally, it's funny. People, when you say I'm writing a script, can you help me here? I mean, it's amazing how they open up. I have a guy that worked at MI5 and I was like, if I want to blow up an FBI building, how would I do that? And he's like, oh, it's amazing what they say. And by the way, I hope nobody ever looks at my Google search history, but it's just so just ask, right? That's one. But I'll tell you what my literary manager says. If it feels like that person, that your character, do it. If you feel like you're never going to be able to put yourselves in their shoes, then don't do it, because then it becomes forced, and having it be forced just because you want to help, that's not going to work. But if, for example, I don't know, let me think of something. Black Lives Matter. Let's think of there's somebody and his brother has been shot, and he's a black person, and he's now struggling with the fact that his brother's been shot. It was useless. I'm not saying it's the police, just somebody shot it. And then there's probably like different reactions that black people would have than white people. However, there's certain things that if my brother was shot, that I would feel, and I could start there, right? And I start with what I know as a human being, and then I try and see, would there be a difference? Like if I was black versus white, I might be more angry. My mom died because of a doctor's mistake. So, you know, I'm not that angry because doctors make mistakes, but I can assume that other people would be more angry, right? And so therefore I can make assumptions. And then, as I said, verify those assumptions. You know, just ask people, especially if you say you're writing. People find that so intriguing. They tell you all kinds of stuff. It's amazing. And that's actually, that helps your writing, because the shit people tell you, pardon my French, but the stuff people tell you, I mean, there's so many more stories that you can tell.
Yeah, I mean, just being interested in people, I've always found has got me a lot further in my conversation. So that again, sorry.
People like me at parties and at events because I ask the weirdest questions. I was like, last time I was like, if you were in a wheelchair and you were at this party, what would you do? And they're like, what? Well, you know, it's just wondering. Standard questions at a party I ask people: if you only had 10 days to live, what would you do? What was your favorite dinner when you were 7? I mean, I asked the weirdest questions.
Me and one of my colleagues often ask each other real random questions about what we would rather have. The one, would you rather have flippers for feet or wings for arms? And that was the next 10 minutes worth of conversation of justifying the answer to which one was which. So yep. I can see what kind of conversations lead to the most fun. But you certainly find out more about the people that you're talking to.
True. Very true.
And Cedars asked the question, large stories often demand a lot of resources in terms of art and engineering. A lot of projects we do at university are very contained and small in scope as a result. So I was wondering if you could provide any advice on building compelling stories that do not bloat a game's scope.
Yeah, again, I think I go to the question of why. You know, ask yourself why stuff is there. It's very hard especially if you become attached to certain things, right? To kill your darlings, as they say. It's a classic. But that is something that you have to do. You have to see what, even if you've written something. I always go back and say, okay, what if I don't need that? What if I take this out? If I take this part out, will the rest still exist? Is it still okay? So that already cleans it up a little bit. And then the other thing also is, I think it's always really good to sit together with the design team in an early stage before they actually before they do that project and before they start working on it, and figure out what are the limitations and the capabilities. Like, for example, if it takes Maisie in our character in our game, if it takes 100 hours just to move an arm, then can I do without that in the storytelling? Could her mannerism just be, I don't know, nodding her head, or could I do dialogue instead of an arm movement? So those kinds of things, I would talk those through with designers and really look at where and this is something over time that you'll see anyways, right? That you get to learn a little bit anyways. But what if you do something, what is the cause and effect of what you do? And I think really sitting together with the design and production team very early on and look at limitations and where their time goes, I think is a really good one. Because a story, by the way, you can always spin something, right? Story-wise, depending on where you put it, you can always spin something. I mean, look at Blair Witch Project. That cost nothing to make, right? And it got to be a cult movie, filmed on a like sort of what now probably would be an iPhone. So it's always possible. It's just being aware of that. I think I always, when I write, for example, as well, TV show now that I'm writing now, I know that the only chance I have is to pitch it to like an Amazon or a Hulu or a Netflix, because nobody else will have the budget. I'm still doing it just because it's fun and I want to practice, and I wanted to try and write something different from a movie. But I have to be very aware of locations. If I write a movie, for example, the drama with the little girl the little girl is based in New Orleans, and the woman that she corresponds with long story, but if she corresponds with somebody in London. The reason for that is London has lots of tax incentives, and so it's very cheap to film. And New Orleans is one of the cheapest places to film in the US. So there's lots of incentives, lots of grants and stuff like that. So I picked those locations. In the TV rom-com, it's San Francisco. I know that's going to be expensive, but it's where the geeks are. And if I write a movie about tech geeks, most likely that's where it is. We could still film it somewhere else and make it look like San Francisco probably, but you know, it's just something you have to be aware of what the implications are. So do your homework, I would say. And in gaming, fortunately, it's virtual worlds. So there you can just talk to people who make the games and just start to get a feeling of, you know, what costs more, what having a higher resolution costs more. Things like having more of an engine, a back end, so having more things happen at the same time, that usually is a little bit more complex to then bring on a mobile game, for example, so that costs more. Animation is always something that costs a lot, right? So be aware of those things, I think, and talk to people that really do that stuff on a daily basis early on when you create the story.
So you mentioned earlier on that you went to New York Film Academy. What was that like? What were your experiences of being there?
Best time of my life.
Presumably you had to relocate as well.
Yeah, it's the best time of my life. I mean, I was only there for a couple of months. I didn't do like a full thing. I did screenwriting only. So I did a 4-month class for screenwriting, and then we wrote the rom-com in those 4 months, basically guided. We had little sessions with 12 people, 3 class. So the whole class was 36, and we got split up into 12. But then we also had writer groups where we intermingled, so we got to read everybody's stuff as well, and then give feedback to everybody's stuff. We watched a lot of movies to sort of pick up on where are story beats, you know, where's the midpoint, where do the acts start and stop. And if they had done it, good and bad movies, by the way, you know, I watch movies differently now, completely differently. I see different stuff now than I did before New York Film Academy. And then also, of course, I love LA anyways. I'm a different person in LA. Everybody's like, oh, there's traffic and this and that. Yes, okay, fine. But what I like is I am the kind of person that gets into all kinds of situations in LA, which here I don't. But there, you know, I do end up at a cast party of a TV show I don't know at 1 a.m. in the morning. And I do end up at a writer's brunch and then figure out, you wrote Desperate Housewives, holy cow. And I do end up at a coffee shop at 5 a.m. in the morning with the guy who wrote 400 episodes at Johnny Carson's, and he's like, you know, really cool at comedy stuff, because I try stuff there. So I'm a different person there. So for me, the New York Film Academy, it was amazing. You got to meet all these new people, students and stuff as well, but because you're there and it's in the middle of things and everybody that's around you does the same thing, it's very much easier to get a script done in 2 months there than being at home, where you have, you know, your dog, your normal life, where you can clean stuff, where you can, you know, do all the things good procrastinating writers do, like, you know, clean out the closet that you've never ever used, or I don't know, sort your tennis rackets by handle or whatever.
What do you use for inspiration?
Oh, everything. I mean, I have a what I call a writer's diary. I just jot stuff down, and it's electronically. I have it on my phone because I go everywhere. But everything. I mean, I had a waiter in just a couple of weeks ago, and he just kept putting the salt pot in the middle of the table, and I'm left-handed, so that gets in the way. So I put it out of the way because I was eating sushi, and you have to reach over. And he kept putting it back, and I'm thinking, that's actually a really good movie scene. What if you could take an OCD waiter that cleans up your table and keeps cleaning up your table while you and your boyfriend potentially are at war, or you're married and you're, you know, in the middle of discussing your divorce and everything going to shambles, and he keeps cleaning up, kind of thing. So, you know, I get inspiration everywhere. It doesn't matter. I can sit outside and watch the scenery and think, oh, I'd love to set like a nice heist, but in the Swiss Alps. I mean, who goes to the Swiss Alps for a heist? Who robs a bank in Switzerland? You know, it could come from anywhere. It's just being open to it. And I find the more you write, the more inspiration you get. So the more I would really, and it sounds so blasé, and I always thought, oh my God, that teacher. But it really is, you know, even if you write something stupid and dumb and you throw it away, just the fact that you are writing means you're thinking. And the thinking part sometimes can be the most fun part, really thinking up the most ludicrous thing and then thinking, yeah, no, probably not really. But still, it would be fun. Dreams even, I mean.
Yeah. Well, I'm speechless from this session today, to be honest. There was so many questions going through my head and everybody else's at the same time, I think, and we've gone
Oh,
on
thank
such
you,
a
Andre.
tangent too. It's fantastic. I don't know whether you want to call it there, and we give you your time back to get back to your busy schedule, or whether you have anything more that you want to talk about. But
Well, I think, so I do have a few more minutes. Today's a writing day. I'm writing Act 3 of my TV pilot, so it's a good day. Those are my fun days when I actually get to clear my schedule and I don't have to do invoices or writing or project management or meetings or calls or whatever. So, you've got me on a really good day today. I think one thing that I would say here, I don't know, it looks like you've got a mix of people here, right? I would love to just understand a little bit more, are there a lot of people here thinking about working and writing in video games, or is it more like going to the design part and just wanting to understand writing?
I think there's a collection of variety, really. There's a lot of artists that enjoy it as hobbies, and same as programmers, and there's some
Nice.
designers in here as well that do sort of modules such as like narrative design, and wanting to sort of, perhaps understand the writer's point of view a little bit more.
Okay.
As someone that's working within that.
3 character story and writing a novel. Excellent. All right, good answer. So maybe then I could say just a few things more about the differences between the ones. As I said, I started on a novel, by the way. I really, Dominic, I think it's fantastic. I had to quit. It was taking too much of my time. I do have this dream of renting a house in Scotland at some point and writing a novel, but it's just, it takes dedication. So kudos to you for doing that on the side. Oh my gosh. I like scripts, they're much faster. But so I think that if you want to be a writer, for me, what worked really well, because I got to writing late, right? I mean, I got to writing really early. What I said before was true. I was a little girl and I was the one that made up my bedtime stories because nobody else did. And I whole long story, drunk in the house and blah, blah, etc. and whatnot. But then I kind of forgot it. I forgot that that's what I did. I forgot that I was good at essays. I went into school. I had to get the money. So I went into tech, which fantastic, right? Absolutely. For money making, absolutely fantastic. And so, when I went to New York Film Academy 6 years ago, that's when I really started writing. Yes, I wrote stuff for, sales pitches. I wrote research papers. I wrote manuals. I wrote a lot. I wrote blogs. I did a blog for, I worked on it. Actually, I went to LA twice. The New York Film Academy is five years ago. 10 years ago, I worked on a children's movie in Los Angeles. And that's where I sort of fell in love with that part of writing, because I got to review the script. I got to work with the actors. It was amazing. I mean, honestly, just the fact that they let me do that on the movie was amazing to me. But I talked myself into it, so it was an amazing experience, one of the best experiences of my life, and I made some really good friends from that too. So that's sort of where I got into it, only 10 years ago. But since then, it's just not left me. These stories, I thought, I'm going to go 5 years ago. I honestly thought I'm going to go to New York Film Academy. I'm going to write this one thing because you have a deadline, so you have to have it finished. And then I see, maybe there's no more story. Everybody has one story in their head. Everybody knows one thing, but maybe there's nothing left. Maybe that's it. And the beauty, I think, of being in LA and doing it there was really that I got exposed to other people a lot that also write stories, and that, as you say, I saw where I could get my inspiration from, and I saw that there's so much more in it. It doesn't mean that I haven't had any film or TV show produced yet, but I have a literary manager, which is a good first step now, right? Yes, he told me to rewrite everything I wrote, so I am doing that, but it's a good first step. I have an entertainment lawyer who, again, also said to rewrite pretty much everything I wrote, but they see potential apparently, so that's good. And then I got into the game because that's something that I actually could get produced because I got the financing and everything. So I would say the difference is really, for one thing, maybe that's not directly storytelling, but I see here people that have ideas and that want to do things, right? Joshua Green says, I want to design, but I want to understand how the writing process works. That's fantastic. I would say the other way around also understands how the business works. I know now that, you know, you don't need to go to LA unless you have at least 3 samples. So 3 fully written scripts, and not in a vomit draft, but in a draft good enough that gets somebody to say, yes, rewrite this and I'm interested. In gaming world, you know, it's earlier. You really work with people and you work off ideas. So know that business, know how you can approach those things, and then that's also where you get part of your inspiration from as well, I think. So the difference in business also is something that you should know. I think I'm a little bit of an odd one out because I do both. Most people do one thing, they go into one thing, they stay into one thing, that I've met at least. You know, I've met the writer of Life is Strange and some other people over time, and they tend to stay in that business. I kind of like the potential of the crossover because it gives you different skills. So I think one tip also that I would give is to try out different things. I've tried a short story. It's not for me, I hate it, but you know, I now know that has different techniques, and there's different things that came up than in a longer story. I've tried like a short movie, also wasn't for me, but it's nice because it got me to be more concise, so it taught me something. I wrote a horror story which everybody loved, and I'm like, really? That was nothing special. So you know, it was about a cannibalism and a cat that saves the person and whatever. So I was like, really? But I don't like cats. I don't know why I wrote about a cat when I don't like cats. But anyway, and the cat's the hero. I mean, who knows? But it just gives you different skills. You know, everything that you try that's new and that's different gives you a different skill. Same thing there, Andre. Storyboarding, yes, great. And stories and storyboarding, if you think about those a lot, because it's the structure of the story is often what drives the experience, right? You won't notice it as a viewer, but like a very good example for me, if we take TV, is this new Apple show, Ted Lasso. I don't know if any of you heard of it, but there was a Super Bowl commercial a couple of years back about an American football coach that comes to the UK and then teaches soccer. And that was this character. He was this dumb guy, as they called him in the UK, wanker, right? And he didn't know anything about soccer. He was like, oh, we're going to play hard for all 4 quarters. No, it's 2 halves. Oh, sorry. Yeah. But we're going to play until we win. No, you can tie. What, you can tie? You know, it's just like that. I mean, he didn't know anything, not even about the grass. And the fun part was, it was like this short thing of like 3 minutes. But because of that, now Warner Brothers and Apple work together on a TV show. I mean, who would have thought that from a Super Bowl funny sketch, right? So you never know where your stories may go. I would say really try out different things. It'll give you skills and it'll give you structure to think about. And you can change any story around and you can make it into things a lot. You just have to figure out, you know, what's your starting point? What are you passionate about? I'm passionate about characters. That's where I start. Other people like the world, and that's where they start, and that's totally fine. But find what inspires you and then try out different things just to see what you can do. And most of all, I mean, as long as it's fun, you know, who cares? I'm writing stuff. I don't know if it ever go anywhere. I mean, I might be totally ignorant, right? I mean, who am I to try to get into Hollywood? But on the other hand, who am I not to try? Why not? Characters, the psychology, that's actually a really good one too, Andrea. If you have the character, if you can make them authentic through knowing how they tick, and the psychology, that's really good. There's actually a really good book about that to help with psychology and characters. I can send the link to Rob if you want, Andrea. Yeah, sure. I can send those. I'm happy to send those. And if there's any other things that you've seen now, like I can send the presentation as well if you want. You have hard time understand other people's thought processes. All right. Yeah, very real problem. What's maybe try to see how you process things. And then, because that can also help, right? People process things differently. It's part of why we, for example, used graffiti in the game and figuring out, you know, things through art. So I like writing. I can't do art. And so I have a hard time understanding art. I don't know how people got to that idea, and frankly, I mean, I probably never will. But I think the trick there is to find a way that you can ask the questions so you understand them. So that's kind. Yeah, no, I understand. I understand. And there's very real disabilities, absolutely, with that. There are ways to sort of structure questions and answers, I think, that makes sense to people in depending on what they have. Like autistic people understand things in a different way. So maybe a good thing to look into some of the teaching materials of how people learn and see what works for you. And then when you understand and find out what works for you, how you learn, then you can actually pose the questions. I love learning stuff in situational areas. So if I go into a party, I hate, to be very clear, I love COVID. I know it sounds really mortifying and bad, but I'm a writer, so I actually now have time. I'm not traveling. Speeches like this don't take like 10 hours of travel plus 400 business development meetings in the same week as this speech. So I love it. It's great. But I learned being put in that situation and asking the questions there or trying something out. Other people really learn by, like my colleague who does our user research, she learns by really digging in deep with people and understanding their psychology and how they tick. For me, I watch people. If I see somebody at a party and they're putting their drink down and picking it up 5 times, I know they're nervous. That helps me more than asking them, are you a nervous person? And so it depends on, how you learn. That's something that's really hard. Whether you have a disability or not, it's really hard to figure out for yourself how you learn. But thankfully nowadays, there are certain studies on, what are the types of learning, and you could try those out, if that makes sense. Dissertation is why is storytelling important in the games and evolution of it? All right, well, a very simple one. Even soccer has a story. So it's not just about kicking a ball around, right? It's about there's a hero's journeys, the team that needs to go to victory. I mean, people play soccer not just because you kick a ball and you get it into the net. They play because, they get to win. They have a career. They have a future. There's a story there, right? So everything really revolves around story in real life. And if you can bring that into games, it just makes those games more relatable. It makes people understand the games better. And it actually gives a lot more potential for games than just, to have a certain action. It gives the potential to actually teach people something through games. And I think that's why storytelling is really, really important. And there's a couple of things on the evolution of storytelling, also just general storytelling evolution, and also on gaming. I don't know if you know, Andrea, you're writing this dissertation, if you know Johan Huizinga. He has and the book is also available on English. It's a really, really good book about the history of play, not necessarily in games, but the history of play. And it really starts very early, before it was digital games, which might be very interesting to read. He's got some good points. So Rob, maybe as notes, I promised the title of that book, and I promised the title of a book about psychology in characters.
Okay. Well,
my favorite game from a story perspective. Ooh, that's a good one. I liked Life is Strange a lot. Yes, Johan Huizinga. Hold on, let me type it in because it's a Dutch guy and it's not. But I'll send Rob the titles and stuff. I like Life is Strange. For one, I like it because we looked at it because there's a lot of similarities with the storm and stuff, right? But I like it because it is one of the few games out there that takes teens as a main character in a believable way, I think. And then I also like it because I get to change that story in some way. So I get to have an impact on that story. I kind of like that. I'm, having that active thing in there. There's interactive movies, for example, don't do it for me because there's a very limited amount of choices you have. You have these, do I save the girl? Do I let her go in the car with the kidnapper? I mean, really, that's your choice. It's like when I used to work at Microsoft and we had these standard of business conduct questions, and one of the questions was, what do you do when your colleague next to you has child pornography on the screen? Do you report it or do you not? I mean, really? That makes my mind go to dark places. And I was like, no, I'm not going to report it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to watch and see what he does and then figure out how he ticks. And then I'm going to make his life really go Enron and hack him and put in all kinds of nasty stuff on his computer, or send pornography of old people to his house, or I mean, it's just, that's the writer in me. That's where my mind goes when I read stupid questions. Anyways, sorry about that. That was a bit of a rant.
Well, thank you very much for today and giving up the time away from your day writing. It's really well appreciated, and I really hope to have more conversations with you in the future, if you feel up for that.
Absolutely. I thank everybody for all of those questions. I mean, it was really interactive. Thank you so much.
I think everybody should show the appreciation really for Rosemary, and coming and talking to us today. So yeah, many thanks from us at the University of Northampton, and hopefully we get to see you again very soon.
I hope so too. Enjoy your day, and go forth and write.
Stay safe, Rosemary. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.